All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the only coast to coast radio show all about the information economy. It's called Inside Analysis. Yours truly, Eric Kavanagh, here today. And with me is a founder and a guy who does really good predictions. He's been building predictive engines for a while now, and he's got a lot of experience, and they have some interesting results already. We're going to be talking to Dan Schwarz. He is the founder of FutureSearch.ai. And as you might imagine, they look into the future. It's a predictive engine. And I'm dying to know how this sucker works and what the results are. There are lots of big topics out there. Of course, AI is everywhere these days. As we talk about on the show, AI is not new, but Gen AI is relatively new and has just taken the world by storm because it is amazing. It can reflect back patterns of text that look like a professional writer created them. Of course, it creates images too. I always remind people they are probabilistic. They are stochastic by nature, and it's a lossy process because what they do is they take text and they convert it to vectors, and then they convert the vectors back to text or images. That is a lossy process. You're going to lose some fidelity when doing that. So there's a tremendous amount of effort being put into grounding these things with retrieval augmented generation, for example, with knowledge graphs. Lots of fun things are happening. But FutureSearch.ai is all about predicting what's coming down the pike. And Dan, so welcome to the show. Thanks for your time today. And let's just start with the hot topic everyone's wondering about: tariffs. You've got some intel on tariffs. Tell me what Future Search is and what you see as a result of this tariff regime that's being bandied about these days.
Hi, thanks, Eric, for having me on the show. Hello, everyone. Yeah, forecasting is interesting. I'm going to talk about it for a little bit so you know where this analysis is coming from and what our angle is. And then I'm going to start pontificating about the future, as Eric said, probabilistically. And so, you got to use your own judgment for what you believe and don't believe. So forecasting has an interesting history. As a field, people really thought about it in terms of weather for a long, long time, and forecasting in games of chance and things like that. Forecasting, when I say the word forecasting, started 15 years ago when Tetlock started doing some academic research, seeing could people actually predict the future better than chance.
Hmm.
That kind of got my goat, and that kind of got me out of my time in big tech and into the world of forecasting full time, and ended up leaving. I left Google to join Metaculus, and then Metaculus to join FutureSearch, and the whole team basically comes from this forecasting background. The entire thing is predicated on the fact that actually some humans are really, really good at predicting the future. And they're not the ones you generally hear from. They're not the talking heads that you get on the web. They are generally these kind of nerdy, the archetypical, crossword puzzle retired person who just kind of sits and reads the news all the time. You put them up to the test, they can do quite well.
Hmm.
FutureSearch is founded on the premise that AI can help with that and that we can kind of scale that out and get superhuman level forecasting. Of course, as you described, Eric, AI is a bunch of vectors. It's very lossy, as you described. It's not actually like an obvious candidate, Gen AI, for predicting the future because it requires a lot of judgment, and judgment is something that humans are good at. But we've got some tricks to make that work, and we've employed some of those tricks, and we have some interesting findings. Yeah, so you asked about tariffs. One of the interesting things about tariffs is that there's a lot more data-driven research, and this is a data show after all,
Right.
and it's kind of being done in mainstream media. If you hear that tariffs from a particular country are a certain percent, you might immediately think, okay, well, if I'm going to buy a product that is imported from that country, it's going to be that percent more expensive, right? But of course, if something is manufactured in the US, then in fact, many, many, many things are imported in order to make that thing. And all of those things are being affected by different tariffs. There's all these different rules, not just the reciprocal ones we've been talking about in the news lately, but all sorts of existing tariff policies on aluminum and on cars and for different countries. And when an American manufacturer imports all of that stuff, it is paying a whole number of different tariffs for different types. So when tariffs change, what is the impact on the American manufacturer who's importing all that stuff? Well, there's no real way to figure it out without figuring out how that stuff is made. And that's one of the things that FutureSearch can do is it can go look at, say, the entire bill of materials for a car like a Ford F-150,
Hmm.
which is hundreds of components, or a Tesla Model 3. Even though these things are manufactured in the US, they import all sorts of things from abroad. And as those things get more expensive, American manufacturing gets more expensive, which means American consumers are paying more money. How much more? We have some numbers on our site. Of course, since we published that, the tariff policy has changed yet again. So we have some new numbers to crunch, which we haven't crunched yet. But if you just kind of trace through the data and just kind of apply the future tariff cliffs, it's actually almost an easy forecasting question because As long as you take the tariffs as a given, it's just kind of a spreadsheet operation. The real challenge is how do you get all that data? And that's where the AI comes in.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, if you sit there and think about what forecasting really does, well, what do you have to do? You have to, first of all, understand where things have been and
Mhm.
get an idea of the trajectory, and then you kind of project that out into the future. Now, of course, the challenge is that you have any number of global developments that can occur, which will impact your predictions. So, in terms of tariffs, it's kind of interesting. I remember before COVID, we had the certain president who was in office back then, and he threw down the gauntlet on tariffs with China, and that was a huge disruption. I mean, I wrote some articles about this. I'm a cyclist, and cyclists and bicycle shops were in a bad way because most of the parts came from overseas, in particular from
Mhm.
China and from Asian countries. And so all of a sudden, your supply chain falls apart. What does that mean? Well, it means people couldn't get their bikes fixed for a year or 2 years. And then, of course, we have COVID, which was an extreme example of tariffs. I mean, I've got all kind of theories about what the heck went on there. But then they kind of went away, and now once again, here we are facing these tariffs again. And it's a great time to be in the predictive business. It's a great time to be, for example, in the world of knowledge graphs and graph technology, because graph is really good at finding relationships and it's sort of mapping out possibilities, and that's what you do. But I think the real key is that you have to kind of find some trajectory and then you push that out into the future, and that's really what forecasting boils down to, right?
That's absolutely right. There are still some unusual cases. For example, forecasters that I work with were very good on the Ukraine war.
Hmm.
Actually, the US government was not too bad at predicting the Ukraine war. Like the signs were there, the State Department said various things. That's not really a trend extrapolation. Yes, you can look at times that Russia has invaded its neighbors in the past. There is a
Right.
history of that, but you
Sure.
can't really take that trend and extrapolate it. You do have to use a lot of judgment. So really,
Hmm.
it's kind of the find the right trend that actually captures what you're doing and extrapolate it, and then put judgment on top of it. But sometimes the judgment actually dominates the data. And this is why I think a lot of people don't think that forecasting is really possible. They think this is all just kind of random chance and that these things are unknowable. Because as soon as you're away from data that you can tether yourselves to, it's like, well, whose opinion is better than anybody else's? And
Right.
kind of the core finding is if you actually just test people rigorously, ask them many forecasting questions over many years and track, a very small percentage of people, well under 1%, are just way, way better at the judgment part of this than anybody else. And those
That's
people are
interesting.
actually really great people to talk to when you want to know about things like, should I buy my Ford F-150 now before, the lease price increases or something like that?
That's interesting. I remember there was a website that came along and it got bought, but it was all about forecasting plane ticket prices.
Mm,
And it was great. This is probably like 6 or 7 years ago now, and it was awesome. And it was baked into, I don't know if it was Expedia or who it was, but it was baked in there. And then someone bought it out and they made it go away, or they baked it into their system or something. So it's like sometimes these predictive technologies are really effective, and then someone doesn't want them around. And then either co-opted it. I think they killed it because all of a sudden it just disappeared and you didn't get the forecasts anymore. And that was very useful because you could sit there. 'Cause let's face it, plane tickets are not terribly inexpensive, especially if you travel a lot. And so to have that predictive capability baked in there was really useful for determining when to travel. And now, of course, but again, to your point, a lot of this comes from data. And I think that, if you can wrap your head around all available data sources, you can get better and better at predicting. So maybe let's talk about the data that you're able to use in your calculations. Where are you pulling that from? Can you reveal all that kind of fun stuff?
absolutely. Yeah. One of the core premises of FutureSearch is that if casual humans can be such good forecasters, then it should be doable without access to private data. And one of
Hmm.
the original findings that really stimulated us, like myself, my co-founder, and a lot of our team to get into this field, was a tournament that was run academically out of Penn, actually, that pitted a bunch of these kind of retired mom crossword type of people who had done well in these tournaments before against the CIA.
Hmm.
And
Wow.
they beat the CIA. The CIA has spies, they have satellites, like they have a lot of data that the casual, Kansas mom doesn't have. But the Kansas moms won
Hmm.
easily, like
Wow.
by a very comfortable statistical margin on predicting geopolitical events that the CIA really should have been better at.
Wow.
And it turns out there's so much data on that stuff that kind of the incremental data from having private sources is not as important as exercising good judgment.
Hmm.
And so the good judgment often is in the selection of data in the first case. What is the base rate? What you said before, Eric, what is the trend that you're extrapolating from? So if you take, your Russia invades Ukraine example, what kind of incident is Russia invading Ukraine?
Hmm.
Would the reference class be something like times that Russia has invaded a neighbor? Would it be times that a large company has invaded a smaller company? Would it be, post-communist regimes? Would it be how often do autocrats invade their neighbors? Like, how often do territorial disputes happen because of, a history of a territorial dispute versus a new one? There's so many different ways that you can slice that. And the judgment to say, I'm going to look at this particular set of examples to inform how I think this one is going to work is actually much, much more important than the details of that example. The
Interesting.
CIA might have the details on, the Crimea invasion or something like that, but knowing what to even look for is just human judgment. And now with FutureSearch, it's AI judgment. But again, primarily it's the fact that human judgment can go so far and get you so much more accuracy than people can really believe on things like that. That's kind of the seed. And then the question is exactly that. How do you get the data? How do you find the data? How do you know what data to interpret? And how do you exercise judgment? But if you can crack that, you can be superhuman in predicting the future. And that's worth a lot of money.
Yeah, well, and one of the things you're working on here is predicting the future of AI and of
That's right.
use of AI and ChatGPT, these AI agents. I mean, talk about a fascinating space to wrap your head around. As I say on the show all the time, this stuff is probabilistic. It does hallucinate.
Mhm.
And I think it's fascinating because, and let's just make a little bit of a tangent here, but I'm in the data world. And I had this epiphany a few weeks ago, in fact, that over the history of computing, dating back 50 years or even more, we were improving on the database, which was the foundation of all information systems. You have a database where you persist data, and we made it faster, we made it more performant, we allowed for more concurrent users, but accuracy was never questioned. It was always 100% table stakes. You absolutely will get out of it what you put into it. And
Mhm.
then what happens? This Gen AI stuff comes out, it's probabilistic, and all of a sudden, it's almost like we're throwing all that quality control out the window for this text generative capability, which is interesting. But do you really want to sacrifice all this quality over all these years? And so all of a sudden now we're on this sort of rearguard strategy of trying to find a way to sort of cage or shepherd or govern what these engines spin out, which strikes me as a massive inflection point. But what do you think about that?
I think you put that really well. And the project of caging it and shepherding it it's truly a problem for the age, but it is tractable.
Hmm.
One of my engineers likes to point out that something like 30% of the processing power of an integrated circuit is just error correction. Yes, it
What?
is the case that these are, transistors that are just kind of flipping between on and off as, they are connected to various voltages and all that stuff. But there's massive amounts of errors.
Hmm.
And the only way that you can reliably get all of that data that you think you're getting all the way down to the bare metal is because of a bunch of error correction techniques.
Hmm.
Now we have this new Gen AI that can come up with all these conclusions and research all these things, and it makes a ton of mistakes. What do? Well, you build in error correction the same way that error correction is in every communication platform, and it's just built into the computing that we have. The Apollo, system had four different computers doing the exact same task, and then the voting on what the correct answer was because that's how much redundancy they needed to get that to be reliable for the moon landing.
Wow.
So who's
Consensus.
going to build that today? Whoever can make something reliable out of unreliable parts, that's the person that's going to take it to the bank.
That's funny. I had a good friend from years ago had an expression that his dad gave him. He said, "You cannot rely on the unreliable." I was like,
Well,
"Oh,
it's
it's
kind
talking
of all
about
we
truth."
have sometimes.
That's
Yeah.
funny. That's
Yeah.
interesting. So your engine that is predicting various things, like the use, for example, of or just the revenue. So you talked about 2025 prediction in 2019, 1 billion in 2024, 13 billion. This is just the AI market in general. When you got APIs, agents, user monetization, all these different things. And there's this prediction by 2029, it's 125 billion. I mean,
That
these.
prediction is from OpenAI itself,
Oh,
as
is it?
reported
Okay.
by the information.
Okay.
I had some critiques of that forecast based on what my view is, but it was actually quite nice that the information actually had this exclusive coverage of OpenAI's own internal projections as involved in their own fundraising. Um,
Interesting.
and this kind of that's the other thing about forecasting is that you're going to do it whether you like it or not. How much money is OpenAI going to make by 2029? Who knows,
Right.
right? It's extremely hard to figure out. But they have to go raise money and people have to make bets on them. So people are implicitly forecasting this anyway.
Right.
So you don't need to be perfectly accurate. You just need to be more accurate than the next guy, and then you can make a return. And so there's going to be all this energy doing this anyway. And so the question is, what is the state of the art? Like, what is the best possible forecast that you can make on OpenAI's revenue in 2029? I've
Hmm.
got my answer, and I'm curious for anybody else's answers. In truth, just like any other forecasting thing, you only find out in 2029 who was right. And you only find out over a large sample size, too, because anybody can get right on one prediction by being wrong.
Right.
But
Right. Well,
systematically over time, can you do it? I mean, a
right.
lot of people who make forecasts don't even check their own track records. So you don't even know,
I was
right?
about to say that. I was about to
Yeah.
throw that question at you, like how often, because I mean, forecasting is crucial in business. It's
Yep.
especially important for manufacturing, for example, for knowing
Yep.
how many cars we could reasonably expect to sell,
Hmm.
because everyone you don't sell is a big liability at some point. It's a
Hmm.
future asset, I suppose. But you know how that works over time, like as they age, that their
Hmm.
value goes way down. It's, there are a lot of factors that come into this. But to your point, how often do people actually go back and this is on to every business that does forecasting? How close were you this year? How close were you last year? Are you getting closer each year? Are you getting further away? Is it just random? I mean, you think about the number of factors that go into these, and there's a lot of alternative data these days. So you can buy alternative data sets. You can track things. I mean, if you get to the point where you can track, how many parts are being manufactured by this range of partners or in your supply chain, that gets very interesting because now you can better predict what you're going to need. Obviously in like for example in automotive manufacturing, really really big deal. Buying a car is not a small thing. That's why you have to get a loan usually to buy a car. Most people have to get car loans. When the interest rates go up and down, I mean that affects everything. So it's like there are all of these factors that are sort of baking in. And it's like, how do you make sure that your predictions are valid and are close enough that you're not really going to get left holding the bag? I mean, that's what we're really trying to avoid in the forecasting world is we don't want to have nowhere near as much money and we don't want to have, well, it's nice you get more, but still it's dangerous, right? And it's like I've talked to all kind of people who have said, and I've seen this in my business. I've been in this business for 15 years. I've never had more than 2 months of cash flow in the bank or been more than 2 months behind. Like, no matter what I do, we'll hire people, we'll do things. And it's like somehow it always stays in that range. At a certain point, you're like, all right, well, I guess this is the range that we should expect, unless we do something remarkable or dramatic. But folks, don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. You're listening to Inside Analysis. All right, folks, back here on Inside Analysis, talking to Dan Schwarz of FutureSearch.ai. And I'm fascinated by your gumption in trying to tackle this, but you've done it before, right? You've built predictive engines before. Can you kind of talk about what goes into it, and especially now in the age of large language models and with deep learning modules everywhere? I try to explain to people there's no limit to the permutations you can put into a deep learning module. You can have all sorts of inference layers, ingest layers, all kind of stuff you can do. The key is to get something that is functional, that does what you want it to do. That's why I think these small language models are probably going to become more prevalent going forward. But just walk us through a little bit of the underpinnings. Like were you able to build and how are you able to build it? And how are you able to make these fairly accurate predictions about the future?
Yeah, thank you for teeing me up, Eric, to talk about this. Again, the thing that's most interesting about this to me is the human art of forecasting. And so to understand the AI art of forecasting, you have to understand the human one, which is a story that I think is really underreported.
Hmm.
So I was at Google. I'd been there for about 5 years. I was actually at Waymo working on the car at the time. And I wanted to predict what collision metrics would be because there's a new version of the software. They're going to simulate millions of miles and drive many thousands of real miles. And you want to know whether the changes to the car are actually going to reduce the rate of, hard braking, cutting off bicyclists, all the things that they're optimizing against.
Hmm.
How do you predict that? Well, we have AI, but back then it was still the state of the art to just have humans. So humans would sit around a conference table and they'd be like, I think this change is going to totally work here based on this experiment that I ran. And some other human would say, yeah, but I tried it the other day and the thing slammed on the brakes and hurt my neck, and I don't believe this is really going to work. And you just kind of put that judgment together. That's the state of the art, like a bunch of decision makers sitting around a table. And I said, okay, well, that's that we can do better than that. So I set up a prediction market. People can make specific bets
Oh,
probabilistically on the collision
interesting.
rates that they think they're going to have in the car.
Hmm.
And I had some growing pains with that, which is kind of out of scope for this discussion. I think management had certain views about what kind of information they wanted circulating to what people. But suffice to say, I brought that back to Google and set up a much larger prediction market. And still running today, and you can read some of their writings. Many thousands of Google employees are just betting on things like Google products, Google technologies. Just like a financial market, one way of getting a view of the future is have a bunch of people
Wow.
bet against each other. And so my first
Interesting.
predictive engine, as you described it, was a platform for humans to bet against each other, and that was it. And again, the thing is shockingly accurate, like
Huh.
much more accurate than you would think for these types of questions about product lines, competitors, technologies, all the things you'd want to know from the perspective inside Google. But then, of course, we had our GPT moment. And then for the first time, there was a non-human thing that could potentially be state of the art in forecasting. And that was kind of the second chapter of my career, which I'm in now. And how to do that, I'd be happy to talk about that ad nauseum. But it's suffice to say, it's wide open because human forecasting is still not very well understood. And if you want to get an AI to forecast well, you probably want to build it off of how humans do it.
Yeah.
At least that's one approach, but that's not particularly well studied. And the way, if you want to make a good AI software engineer, well, we know how to do good human software engineering. So turning that into an AI test is plenty of data, plenty of practice, pretty easy to check if you're doing it right.
Hmm.
Build a good AI forecaster. It's like, well, what are those humans that are getting these things right in these tournaments? What are they actually doing differently from the people who end up losing all of those bets? That's kind of
Yeah.
step one to try to figure that out.
Well, you're reminding me, I'm a big fan of cliches, and the cliche that would seem to apply here is put your money where your mouth is, right? If
Mm-hmm.
someone's going to put money down to bet on something, that's their skin in the game. So they're paying attention. I think that's a very, very clever approach that you took because you're really leveraging the wisdom of the crowds
That's
by
right.
focusing on who is willing to put their money where their mouth is and say,
Mm-hmm.
this is what I think is going to happen. I mean, that's kind of what the stock market does if you get
That's
right down
right.
to brass tacks, right? It's a giant casino of companies that you can bet on and put your money where your mouth is. And then, of course, all things go ebb and flow. And we have these tariff discussions, and the markets are like, they went way down, and it's kind of amazing and kind of scary that one person's words can can disrupt so much because
Yeah.
when there was some softening on the tariffs, boom, like 90-day pause, and the stock market shot up 3,000 points, which was like an all-time points gain, not
Mm-hmm.
percentage wise. I think it was second percentage wise, but still, here you have in the stock market, you have millions of people putting their money where their mouth is. And so that's a perfect example. Was that kind of where you got the idea, or how did you get the idea to say, hey, let's just put out a marketplace and have people bet on it?
Oh, I'm far from the first person to have the idea of building a betting market in order to predict the future. It's actually got a history going back decades.
Hmm.
People tried this in the 1990s. HP had one, Microsoft investigated one, but mostly it was Google in 2005 that built their own internal prediction market that
Hmm.
showed that it actually worked. So then, 10 years later, when I'm there, I'm saying, oh, we can do this, but much bigger. So it was more the execution and like getting the buy-in to run it and asking the right questions. The innovation of using betting markets to get forecasts is quite old. It goes all the way back to the foundation of probability theory, which is all about trying to predict the results of dice games and people playing against each other.
Hmm.
Prediction markets are a pretty old technology, but again, this is a show about data. And so, the main topic here is AI. Like, okay, so humans are the state of the art at everything, every, image classification, making Hollywood movies, programming. We have all these impressive AIs. Humans are still king in basically every single field. Maybe there's a couple places like diagnostic medicine, maybe and games like chess, of course, which are not really real world activities, where it's kind of competitive. What about forecasting? Can we get superhuman forecasting out of AI? And if you'd like, I'll tell you a little bit about kind of the insides of this, of like, what do you
Yeah,
actually do with AI in order to try and make a better prediction?
sure. Yeah.
Um,
Is it
yeah,
like a
but
Monte
now,
Carlo assessment? I mean, I'm familiar with
yes.
Monte Carlo assessments where in fact, just going way back in the time machine here when I was what, 13 or 14, I got the Commodore 64. I learned to program in BASIC, and I wrote two games. I wrote an asteroid style game, and I wrote a game to run 100 battles because I was big in Dungeons and Dragons.
Mm,
You could put in armor class, number of soldiers, things of this nature, what weapons you have, and it would do 100 battles. And then it would tell you your percentage chance of winning this battle. Now, I didn't get into the spells modules or things, which would have been pretty intense. But that's a Monte Carlo assessment. It'd say, all right, you got a 77% chance of beating these trolls if you go ahead and engage them in battle. That's kind of fun. But that's kind of what you're talking about, right?
yes, but those methods don't get you very far in practice. Yeah, the kind of Monte Carlo stuff, and really the whole field of time series forecasting is all based on having such robust data that basically the
Interesting.
future is predictable from the past.
Hmm.
And in many cases, it is. If your example from before the break, you're talking about supply chain forecasting. I need to make sure I've got enough inventory and it's not just kind of sitting idle. If you just look at the trend of things coming and going out of your warehouses, that is a very strong predictor of the trend of them coming and going in the future. If you kind of
Interesting.
model in a certain amount of growth, you're probably going to get it right within a pretty tight margin. The algorithms behind that have been studied for many decades, is pretty well understood. But then as soon as something weird happens, it all falls apart. You were
Hmm.
talking about COVID and tariffs and kind of bicycle parts. Every single supplier of bicycle parts was caught completely flat-footed by that. Like none of them in their supply chain models, whether it's kind of like a small bicycle operation or a giant corporation, none of them were expecting that to happen. And the time series models just become basically worthless. I saw an example of this inside Google with their own data center planning. When COVID hit, it was just complete chaos. Every single model was basically useless. It said absolutely
Right.
nothing. And what do? They brought in humans and they said, okay, person with judgment, when do you think this part's going to be available again? Like when are the boats going to be able to get through the Red Sea, or when are the port of Los Angeles, when is that line going to get queued out so we can get the stuff to our data center and lay those cables? There
Right.
was no algorithm. There was no time series because what are you going to do? Like go back to the last pandemic and then try to model like the last data points?
Right.
You have to use your judgment. And almost everything, tariffs, what's going to be executive policy? You can't build a time series of tariff policy and then use that to predict future tariff policy. It doesn't work at all. You have to use judgment. And this is where it gets quite hard. I mean, even humans getting that judgment right is very difficult. As I'm saying, is I think it's undervalued what we've learned about that academically. But then AIs, you think you can go to ChatGPT and just ask it, what's Trump going to do next? Like, how can a token predictor figure
That's
that
right.
out, right? And I'll tell you a little bit about how I see the answer to that question. But I think fundamentally, the most important things in life don't have time series data behind them. So time series modeling doesn't work.
Interesting.
All about judgment. And where does good judgment come from? That's the big question.
Well, and you make such an excellent point about time series, and I've thought about this for many, many years. It really matters where you put those markers.
Hmm.
If you're trying to examine some flow of information or resource or whatever it is, like where you place those markers makes a huge difference. If you place it too tightly, you'll completely miss the trend. If you make it too obtuse, you completely miss the trend. And you got to watch out for averages, right? It's like if I get 10 people who are 10 years old and 10 people who are 30, the average age is 20. Well, no one in that room is 20 years old. They're either 10 or 30. These are very, very different things. So the sort of granularity and the application of the algorithm is what really matters, and that gets down to judgment, right?
That's absolutely right. Yeah. So as an example, in this OpenAI, can they really have 125 billion of revenue by 2029? One of the questions that a good forecaster will ask, and we ask this question, although I don't think I've seen anyone else ask this, which is how long does it normally take companies to get that level of revenue?
Yeah,
That's just kind of setting your marker somewhere of like, well, if you're saying this company is going to achieve this goal, tell me about the history of other companies achieving this goal and what data do you have there? And
right.
it turns out it's relatively easy to research because very few companies have reached 10 billion or 100 billion in revenue, and you can just plot them. And again, there's a lot of judgment in exercising this. We decided when looking into this that companies like Walmart were not very good to look at because they have very high revenue but very low margins. And so
Hmm.
hitting revenue targets is less interesting for like a mass retailer. But in a high margin business like software, who are the people who have made that milestone and how long did it take? And so we just did the research. And again, AI can really help you by just finding all this financial data and putting it together.
Hmm.
I got the numbers here. The time for Microsoft to reach 100 billion in revenue, it took them 28 years. It took Amazon 18 years. It took Google 14 years. It took Facebook 11 years, and it took ByteDance 6 years. And if you
Wow.
plot those in a time series, it's actually this very smooth thing where that time seems to be dropping about 40% per decade. And it's
Wow.
actually on trend for somebody to reach $100 billion dollars from the beginning of them having revenue in 4 years, which is what OpenAI is basically claiming here from 2025 to 2029.
That's
Um,
amazing.
so again, incredibly simple data, but the fact that you look for that data and take that trend seriously and try to reason, is this a trend I can extrapolate or not? That's all judgment. And it's very, very hard to get an AI to do that, but it's not impossible.
That's very interesting. I'm going to throw a bit of a curveball at you and to see what you think about this because it does get into judgment. So many years ago, I was researching gross domestic product, and I was looking on, I think it was on the World Bank website, and I was looking at the different countries around the world and what their GDP was. And in 2000, I think it was, the U.S. GDP was $10 trillion. And Russia's GDP, I mean, you want to take a guess what it was in 2000? Because remember, back then we were bipolar. It was the two big powers of the world were the United States and Russia. And we were 10 trillion. What do you think Russia was at back then?
I'm definitely going to get this one wrong, but I guess I know that Russia had a wild time in the 1990s where basically the oligarchs just kind of sold off the country for parts, and it was
Right.
basically a petrostate at that point.
Yeah,
So, like, how
right.
much oil revenue, if it's all coming from oil, oil can't really be a trillion. I don't know. I'm going to say 500 billion. So, what, like 5% of the US?
That's very close. You're
Oh,
very
yeah?
good. So it was actually $330 billion.
Ooh,
Okay.
that's very low. I thought I was low, but that's
And I'm
even
thinking to
lower.
myself, I was like, wait a second. How is this possible that you have two superpowers? One is 10 trillion, the other is 340 billion dollars. How is it possible that the US economy is 30 times the size of Russia? And eventually I had the epiphany. I said, I know why, because it's on the black market over there. Like here it's all transparent.
Hmm.
Over there it's all shady deals that are not transparent to the general public or to these data collection agencies because it's just simply not possible that it could be that far off. And I'm pretty sure it's like you need some transparency and you need to use judgment, right? And this is still the case with all these AI engines. You know, I get stats come back at like, huh, are you sure about this? No,
Hmm.
that was a hallucination. So that's like the human
Yep.
judgment. And it's like, it's a bit, I mean, it's a bit frustrating because you're like, well, what's the end game here? You know, and you look at like an OpenAI, for example. Well, I joke, should they be called OpenAI anymore since now it's a black
Right.
box, right? And that's a very different thing. And you know, what's going to happen? But you know, people say, oh, there are rules, there are laws. Okay, that's true. There are rules and there are laws, and people break them all the time, like constantly. Even
Hmm.
people in power break rules all the time. Like you really, if you look at our society, it's really predicated on trust. And I learned this when I worked for Russians years ago. I worked for Alexander Kalanich in Whiskey, the post-Soviet Russia. And I realized that culturally, those guys can screw you left and right. And it's not really a problem. It's normal to do that sort of thing over there. And I remember speaking to a consultant, a very good SAP ERP consultant, like go out there, you know, basically doing some sort of brownfield migration from EC, whatever it is, over to SAP S/4HANA, like really complicated stuff, right? And he laughed. He goes, "Yeah, you're right." He goes, "We have to watch out for working with companies from that part of the world because they will find any which way to catch you on something and then just pull the string." And so it's like here in the West, we really do have a strong foundation of trust, and I think that is absolutely central to the success of our businesses. But 45 seconds till the break. You want to comment on that real quick?
Oh yeah, I mean, I very much sympathize with that. And I would say the overall mission of forecasting is very much on the kind of shining the light on things. I agree, it's not OpenAI anymore. But what's interesting is if you ask an OpenAI model a lengthy question, it'll write like 5 pages of analysis for you now.
Right.
Making reasoning transparent and making forecasting transparent so people can see not only what you
Uh,
believe, but why you believe it is a big part of building this kind of trust.
that's an excellent point, and I do think there's a lot of FUD being thrown around about these things, obviously, but they are really, really good at a lot of different things. But folks, don't touch that. We'll be right back. You're listening to Inside Analysis. All right, folks, back here on Inside Analysis, talking to Dan Schwarz, Schwarz. Look him up on LinkedIn of FutureSearch.ai. And I think I really love that point you just made at the end of the last break about how the transparency of the reasoning in the engines helps to build trust. And I do think the hallucinations are real. They happen. They're usually pretty obvious. I mean, it just kind of misinterprets something. Like last night, I'm a Pittsburgh Pirates fan now that I live here. I'm a Chicago White Sox fan growing up. They broke the record last year, most losses in a season. So good for you guys. That was amazing. I still root for them. But the Pirates, our pitcher last night, he struck out the first six batters of the Angels. And I'm like, that's amazing. Like that does not happen very often. I said to the wife, I'll bet the record is probably like nine of like starting the game with strikeouts and getting through. And I did a search on Google and it said like 24. And I was like, that there's no way that's the case. But it was 24 strikes. I was like, no, I said strikeouts. So it kind of it you know it got close. I had to do some further research to find the actual record is nine. So three full innings strikeout, 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 strikeout. That's amazing, right? So it's around the edges. It's still a bit rough, but I remind people again, these are consensus engines more than anything else. They are giving you the average of what they've seen based upon their training and upon your prompt, right? But you made this excellent point that showing you the reasoning and just asking more and more detailed questions helps you understand how they work. And I got to say, ever since studying these large language models, I've been studying myself and trying to figure out, well, how do our brains capture information? How do our brains represent things? Because you have facts like fact tables in a database, for example, things that you remember. And actually, this is part and partial to the whole agentic AI discussion too. If you want to comment on that, like beliefs, desires, and intentions, how the agents have these things. And as soon as I understood that, I was like, huh, I can now see how they would be able to kind of be semi-autonomous because they have a set of beliefs. Then you give them the desires, what they're supposed to do, and then the intention is the plan. Like that gets kind of interesting. But what are your thoughts on that on this future of agentic AI, for example, and being able to predict things and forecast things with AI? What are your thoughts on kind of where this is all going?
Well, my main view is that we have turned cognition into an engineering problem, and that is profound.
Wow.
I have, particular forecasts about how well agentic systems will perform on various tasks. We specialize in web research agents, and we have a bunch of evals. So, for example, I know what types of situations OpenAI deep research is better than Gemini deep research is better than
Wow.
Complexity deep research, because you have
Wow.
to study this if you're going to use systems like this in order to make judgments about the future. But generally speaking, the problem is solvable. And I think people need to really reckon with that. When you have human agents, you have human workers, all that stuff is kind of baked in. All of the genetics, the way that our brains are wired, they just kind of are what they are. We can learn certain things. But we now have intelligences that can be engineered. And that means you can engineer them differently. So
Hmm.
I don't know what particular paradigm is going to be the one that works. I don't know if it's going to be some chain of thought, some reinforcement learning, some pre-training, some different algorithm.
Hmm.
But the point is, we basically have a bunch of brain surgeons working on these models, trying to coerce them to think about things in different ways and studying what works and what doesn't work. And fundamentally, I do think this will work. And I do think that agentic systems that can reason in the way that humans do on messy human problems, which has never been possible before in AI, will come. But will it come next year or 5 years or 10 years? I mean, this is what we spend our time trying to figure out.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I'll just kind of pivot to a little bit of something that bugs me, which is the truth and getting to the truth. And I'm a media guy. And so, like, right out of college, I got a job at a small town newspaper, and my publisher told me one thing that is absolutely foundational for integrity in journalism. He said that the word says, S-A-Y-S, should be like punctuation in a news story. His point was that every story should be like, he says this, she says that. Here's what we verified, usually by what someone else said. Now, you can also cite sources like records and databases and treasuries or whatever it is that you're talking about. Those are the fact sets that are publicly available or that you got access to. But it's important to not read a news article that says Senator Johnson believes such and such or fears such and such or wants such and such because you don't know. You don't know what he fears, wants, believes. You know what he says he fears, says he wants, says he believes. And that to me is very important for having integrity in storytelling. And I keep thinking to myself, at some point soon, maybe because of technologies like FutureSearch.ai, we're going to get better at really understanding what is actually happening. Because you figure at scale, like, how is it that we don't know things? Like, I just give you an example. CO2. I was doing research on for a project called The Death of Journalism, and I asked Google, I said, what percentage of the atmosphere is CO2? And it told me, and then right underneath it, it has people also ask, and the question people also ask was, is Earth's atmosphere 90% CO2? I was like, no, it's not. I think it's 0.04%. It's not 90%. How the hell did people get to the point where they think it's 90%? And it's because the media talks about it all day long, about CO2. And I'm thinking to myself, that is shockingly inaccurate. I mean, here we are in the information age, and people are wildly off in terms of understanding something that everybody talks about, which is CO2. But what do you think about? Because here's why I get excited. I think that what you have could wind up being very useful in helping people understand markets, like business markets, like the auto industry or the retail or all these other things, because you are gathering a lot of information and you're making these fairly accurate or at least well-grounded predictions about what's coming down the pike. But what do you think about all that?
Yeah, I think many people have thought, especially since 2016, that our quote unquote epistemic commons have been tainted. Like the information is full of malicious intent and false information, and Google and
Wow.
Facebook have been falling further and further behind in controlling it.
Right.
AI could make this much worse, but it could also make it much better. So one of the things that FutureSearch does in order to exercise the right judgment over data is try to validate it. And
Hmm.
so, yeah, if you see janitor, senator something says something or other, you want to say, is that true? You
Right.
just Google it. You can ask ChatGPT, hey, I read, Elon Musk is a spy. Is that true?
Right.
We'll try to find some evidence. We have specialized tools. It's like trace down the original source. Like look at different flavors of this. What do different people say? Are those people credible?
Right.
One thing that AIs hallucinate a little bit. They used to hallucinate a lot, but one thing they do now is they credibly believe almost everything they read. So if you ask
Hmm.
a very smart AI something, it will go and find some SEO spam or some Reddit comment or some complete nonsense that gives the answer and say, look, I found it. I found the answer. It's
Right.
not exercising judgment over that data. Like, is that credible? But this,
Right.
again, is a solvable problem now. This is an engineering problem. This isn't even really a philosophical problem. It's
Hmm.
can you build a good claim validator? We have one internally at FutureSearch. It's a claim validator. It takes a claim and it outputs the probability that it's true. We use
Nice.
that for all the critical data that goes into our forecasts and our decisions.
That's very, very interesting. That's really good stuff, I have to say, because I can see, and how you could sort of build out a fact set of what we can accept as being real. Because, and you made a point earlier about checking your forecast. Were you right last time when you made these predictions? And part of
Mhm.
the challenge of the media these days, and why I think mainstream media is now kind of like the emperor who has no clothes, because all of a sudden you can get facts on platforms like X or Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn or whatever. Like you can now get to information without having to go through these clearinghouses, which were the media companies. Now, some of it may be inaccurate. This is very, very true. And what you want from the media is some responsible investigation and reporting, but they're moving so fast and they're just falling apart left and right. And so it's almost like we're wobbling like, maybe the bridge that was going like this
Mhm.
because of the
Yeah.
wind hitting a certain frequency, and it like when it created, that's kind of where we are right now with reality and information and news. And it's why a lot of people say I don't even listen to the news anymore because they don't believe what they're hearing. And that to me is a bit of an issue, so but I think that I love that you refer to these as solvable problems, engineering problems, not even philosophical problems. So I think the future could be bright if we all are just a little bit more responsible in how we act and how we exercise our judgment. What do you think?
Yeah, I actually legitimately think this is the worst point probably in all of human history for misinformation and, the bridge fluctuating and nobody can trust anything. And it's
Right.
only going to get better from here. I mean, I will say if you just I was complaining earlier that ChatGPT is gullible in various ways, but I think it is already like top 2% for humans if you just ask it some question and it had to exercise some judgment.
Right.
These things, like you said earlier, they're kind of the average of all the information they've been trained on.
Right.
They're not particularly biased. They have like deep factual knowledge in many, many areas, more than any one human could have. And when
Right.
it looks at something, it's quite credible that the state of the art LLM, the one you get for free without even putting in your credit card, is going to give you better judgment than an expert, a journalist, like all sorts of people. If you don't trust those people, it doesn't mean you
Right.
shouldn't trust the AIs. You should be skeptical. But
Right.
they're getting better and better, and they're already very, very good compared to other
That's
techniques, Googling, Reddit, asking your friend. I mean, whatever the techniques we had in the past.
that's
I
funny.
mean, I'd rather ask O3 or Gemini 2.5 Pro at this point.
That's funny. All right, folks, podcast bonus segment is coming up next. We'll be right back. You're listening to Inside Analysis. All right, folks, podcast bonus segment here with a fascinating conversation with Dan Schwarz of FutureSearch.ai. You hit on a couple really, really good points there, and there are massive data points that are just jumping out at us right now. Stack Overflow. You probably saw this. Stack Overflow lost like 50% of its traffic in the last, I don't know, it's like 6 months or something. And it's because people are just using Copilot. They're just in ChatGPT or wherever they are asking questions. And guess what? About that kind of stuff, about detailed systems, configurations, and things of this nature, it's pretty darn good. It's pretty good at knowing which tools work with which other tools. They can even throw some code at you. It's not going to be perfect, so you have to be careful about using it. But still, you think about the time that is saved by asking these questions. I mean, I frankly deeply wonder about the future of higher education. Like, why would I spend $50,000 a year to have my child go deep into debt or me go deep into debt, learning what she could sit there and just hack away at ChatGPT and learn on her own time all the doodah day. So, I mean, that is a massive, massive disruptive force in our world. What do you think?
Yeah, and that's why I am dedicating this portion of my career in building technology that tries to forecast this stuff. Because
Nice.
if we live in a world where 18 years from now, there's no point in getting a college degree, then maybe you don't need to start saving for a college degree now.
Right,
And let
right.
alone 18 years from now, what about 10 years from now or 5 years from now? Or what about today when you're learning some trade and it turns out that the free system on the web, again, you don't even have to put in your credit card. It's already better than you were supposed to be with your degree. I think
That's
being able to
crazy.
forecast this stuff, as you know, in writing, in medicine, in law, in finance, like reading the tea leaves is very, very important for people's businesses and their career planning. And I think a lot of people have this kind of learned helplessness. Like, well, nobody can predict the future, so I'll just kind of
Wow.
ignore it and just kind of do what I was already doing. The
Wow.
future is very hard to predict, but it's not impossible. And taking this very seriously will give huge dividends to people who can be not completely correct, but just more correct than other people on what's about to happen in AI.
That's an excellent quote to close on. Well, folks, look this gentleman up online, Dan Schwarz of FutureSearch.ai, just like it sounds. I'm sure we'll be hearing more from him in the future. Send me an email if you want to be in the show, info@InsideAnalysis.com. Talk to you next time, folks. You've been listening to Inside Analysis.